Rain hammered the glass of a Seoul mansion the night a Nigerian student dropped out of a forgotten service tunnel and landed in the one room nobody was allowed to enter. A man who could make an entire district in Seoul go silent found her standing in his study, soaked, furious, unafraid. She did not beg, she did not run, and something he had buried at 9 years old opened its eyes inside him and refused to close them again. Welcome to Strictly Afrokorean Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. 3 hours before that, Funmi Adeyemi was sitting on the floor of a shared flat in Sinchon with a photocopy of a 1974 building plan spread across her knees. She was 26, a master's student in architecture, curvy, tired, and beautiful in a way she never had time to notice. She had traced this young Bukdong estate through the city archive because architecture was the only weapon she owned. Old houses always kept their secrets in the same place. In the service corridors, nobody bothered to draw twice. 20 minutes later, her phone lit up with her brother's name. Tunde had come to Korea on a work visa and lost it to a lending house called Yeonhwa, who took his passport as collateral and then took his months. He told her he was fine. She could hear that he was not. She told him she would fix it, ended the call, and sat in the dark with her mother's coral bead necklace pressed between her palms until her hand stopped shaking. Across the river, at that same hour, Kang Min-ho stood at the window of a house that had been built for a family that no longer existed. He was 34. He ran the largest private organization in the country and had not raised his voice in 9 years because he had never needed to. Men measured their sentences before speaking to him. His housekeeper, Kim Ha-jin, left his dinner at the door because he ate alone. He owned everything in the room and wanted none of it. That night, the rain came down hard enough to hide footsteps. Funmi went in through the old coal chute on the north wall, exactly where the 1974 plan said it would be, and came out in a service corridor that smelled of cold stone. She had one goal, a brown envelope in a study safe with her brother's passport and the contract that had swallowed his life. She had rehearsed the route for 11 days. She had not rehearsed being seen. 90 seconds later, the study lamp clicked on behind her. Min-ho was standing by the door in a black shirt with his sleeves turned back, perfectly calm, as though he had been expecting weather. Funmi did not scream. She turned to face him with her chin up and rain running off her jaw and told him that she was not leaving without what belonged to her family. 4 of his men filled the corridor behind him. He lifted one hand and they stopped like a held breath. For a long moment, nobody moved. He asked her name and she gave it. He asked how she had entered his house and she told him the truth, that his grandfather's architect had drawn a 7th passage and never drawn it again. He asked if she understood what happened to people who broke into this house. She said that she understood exactly and that she had come anyway because her brother had nobody else. Min-ho stared at her and something behind his ribs turned over. Later that night, after his men had searched her and found nothing but a torch, a copied plan, and a coral bead necklace, Min-ho did something that would be discussed in whispers for months. He told them to open the gate. He watched her walk out into the rain with her back straight, and when the tail light of the taxi had gone, he realized he was still holding the necklace they had taken from her pocket. He did not send it after her. He put it in his desk. The next morning, Funmi woke with a cut across her palm from the chute grating and a strange humming anger under her skin. She had failed. She had also survived, which the internet said was not usually the outcome. She bandaged her hand, went to her 9 o'clock studio class and told nobody, but she kept seeing the way he had lifted that hand to hold 4 men still and the way he had looked at her afterwards, not like prey, like a question. That same morning, in a car on the way to the port, Min-ho asked his second, Ryu Sung-min, to bring him everything about a Nigerian student called Funmi Adeyemi. By noon, he had it. Scholarship, top of her cohort, part-time shifts at a bakery in Hewa, a brother named Tunde carrying a debt of 38 million won to a lending house that Min-ho's organization had quietly owned for 6 years. He read the file twice, then he read the interest schedule and felt something he had not felt in a long time: shame. 2 days later, Tunde called his sister, laughing and crying at once. The men from Yeonhwa had come to his dormitory, but not for money. They had returned his passport, torn the schedule in half in front of him, and left without a word. Funmi sat down on the pavement outside the bakery with flour on her sleeves. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the shape of a debt that she had not agreed to, and she knew exactly whose signature was on it.
The following evening, a delivery arrived at her flat. A winter coat, dark green, precisely her size, no card. Her flatmate screamed with delight. Funmi did not touch it for an hour. Then she checked the label, saw the price, and laughed once, furiously at the ceiling. Somewhere across the city, a man who had never bought anything for anyone in his adult life was sitting in a boardroom, missing every third sentence, thinking about whether the collar would suit her. By the end of that week, Funmi had made a decision that her flatmate called suicidal and she called practical. She would not be bought. She would go back, return the coat, return whatever else he thought he was doing, and take the contract itself out of that safe so that no one could ever revive it. So on the Friday night, in dry weather this time, she went in through the cold chute for the second time in 11 days. 90 seconds later, she found the study lamp already on. There was a tray on the desk with 2 cups and a pot of barley tea, still steaming. Min-ho was sitting in the armchair with the brown envelope in his lap and the safe standing wide open behind him. He said, without turning, that she was 4 days later than he had expected. Funmi stood in the middle of his study with her heart slamming and understood that she had never once surprised him. For the next few minutes, neither of them pretended. She told him she did not want gifts from a man whose company had put a chain on her brother. He told her the chain was gone and would not return. She asked what he wanted in exchange. He said nothing, and she said that everyone wanted something. Min-ho looked at the tea going cold between them and admitted the only true thing he had said aloud in years, that he wanted her to keep coming back. Later that same night, he made her an offer instead, because a man like him did not know how to ask for anything without dressing it as business. The east wing of the estate, the old servant quarters, and the glass house beyond it had stood sealed since he was 9. He wanted them restored. He would pay a graduate architect's fee, which was more than her scholarship, and she would work on site 3 days a week. Funmi, who owed the world nothing but her own future, said she would think about it. The next day, she thought about it for 11 hours and said yes for 2 reasons. One was the fee. The other she did not admit to herself until much later, on a night when lying was no longer possible. She wanted to know what kind of man kept a wing of his house sealed for 25 years and what he was so afraid of finding inside it. Quick question for you while we are here, besties. If a dangerous man erased your family's debt without asking for anything, would you walk away or would you go back and ask him why? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. That Monday, Funmi arrived at the front gate at 8 in the morning with a tape measure, a hard hat, and an expression that dared anyone to comment. Kim Ha-jin, the housekeeper, met her at the door and said nothing about the coal chute, which meant everyone knew. The east wing smelt of dust and old winters. Beyond it stood the glass house, its panes green with age, and inside, in cracked pots, the skeletons of 100 white camellias. An hour later, she found the small brass plate at the base of the central bed. It read that the garden had been planted by a woman named Kang Min-ho in the spring of 1989. Funmi photographed it, then looked up and saw Min-ho standing at the far end of the glass, watching her through 25 years of dirt. He did not come in. He never came in. That afternoon, she learned from Ha-jin that Eun-ji had been his mother and that she had died in that glass house when he was 9. Over the next fortnight, a routine formed the way frost forms, quietly and completely. Funmi worked Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Min-ho found reasons to be home on exactly those days. He read reports in the corridor outside the East Wing. He asked about load-bearing walls with the intensity of a man asking about her childhood. She answered shortly at first, then less shortly, and by the second week she caught herself saving observations through the day to tell him. One Wednesday, it rained so hard that taxis stopped running. Min-ho drove her home himself, which made Seong-min's eyebrows climb into his hair. And they sat in silence for 6 kilometers before Funmi asked him why he had let her go the first night. He said in 9 years, nobody had spoken to him the way she had in that study. Not with courage, with expectation, as though he might turn out to be a decent man. A few days later, she noticed the small things and could not stop noticing them. Her favorite bread from the Hewa bakery appeared in the East Wing kitchen every morning she worked. The site heaters were replaced with better ones the day after she mentioned the cold. Her studio submission deadline was in his diary, and on the night before it, a desk lamp arrived at her flat that cost more than her monthly rent. She rang him to complain and ended up talking to him until 2 in the morning.
That same week, Funmi told her flatmate that nothing was happening, and her flatmate laughed for a full minute. Nothing was happening in the sense that he had never touched her. Everything was happening in the sense that when he entered a room, her whole body knew before her eyes did. She was resistant on principle. Her principles, she was discovering, were not what stood up when he walked in. The next Monday, she stayed late measuring the glass house roof and came out at 9 to find him sitting on the step in the cold with 2 paper cups of tea because Hajin had told him she had not eaten. He did not say that he had cancelled a meeting with the council to be there. Seong-min, waiting by the car with his ears turning red, said it for him 3 days later, and Funmi thought about it for a week. That same Thursday, a grey saloon car she did not recognize idled at the end of her street for 20 minutes while she walked home from her shift. She noted the number plate out of habit and forgot it by morning. It would matter later. It would matter enormously. The following Friday, the firm handling the structural certification sent a junior partner to the site. His name was Nam Jae-won. He was charming, he was funny, and he stood too close to Funmi over the plans for 20 minutes while telling her she was wasted in academia. She laughed politely, she stepped back twice, and she felt, rather than saw, Min-ho arrive at the doorway behind them and go absolutely still. For the rest of that afternoon, Min-ho said perhaps 9 words. He signed what needed signing. He looked at Jae-won once, and Jae-won's hands began to shake around his own pen. When the man had gone, Funmi turned on Min-ho with her arms folded and asked him what exactly that had been. He said it had been nothing. She said that his jaw had a different opinion. Later that evening, in the empty glass house, with the light going amber through the dirty panes, he finally told her the truth, in a voice so low she had to lean in. That he had spent his whole life not wanting things, because everything he had ever wanted had been taken from him in that room. That she had walked into his study soaked and unafraid and undone all of it. That he did not know how to want a person quietly, and he was sorry she had to see it. Funmi stood very close to him and did not step back. She told him that jealousy was not love, that if he ever tried to decide who she spoke to, she would be gone by morning, and that she needed him to hear that. He said he heard it. Then she told him the other true thing, the one that cost her more, that she thought about him constantly and that she was terrified. That night, neither of them slept. She lay in Sinchon staring at a desk lamp she had not paid for. He sat in a study with a coral bead necklace in the drawer under his hand and understood calmly and completely that he would give away everything he owned before he would give her up. It was not a decision. It was simply a fact that had finished arriving. 2 weeks later,
the danger stopped being theoretical. A man called Park Do-hyun, who ran the northern districts for Min-ho's predecessor and had waited 9 years for a mistake, began to tell the council that Min-ho had gone soft. He had evidence: a foreign student walking freely through the Songbuk-dong estate, a frozen debt book, a leader who now drove himself. Do-hyun did not want proof of weakness. He wanted a lever, and he had already found where it lived. The following Wednesday, Funmi left the fight late and noticed a grey saloon car behind her taxi for 4 turns. She told herself she was imagining it. That night, she mentioned it to Min-ho in passing, the way you mentioned weather, and watched his face change into something she had never seen on it before. He did not shout. He simply asked her very quietly to describe the car, and by morning there were 2 men outside her building who pretended to be delivery drivers and were extremely bad at it. The next day, Funmi walked out and told them she knew exactly what they were, that she would not be followed like a parcel, and that if Min-ho wanted her guarded, he could come and say it with his own mouth. He arrived within the hour. They argued in the street in the cold for 10 minutes, and it ended with him saying that he could survive her hating him, but not her being hurt, and that she could survive danger, but not being managed. They compromised that evening, badly, like people do. She accepted 1 driver. He accepted that she would still take her Thursday shift at the bakery. Neither of them said the real thing, which was that the argument had not been about cars at all. It had been the first time either of them had admitted out loud that there was now something between them worth taking hostage. A few days later, the storm came, and with it, the catalyst. Tunde rang his sister from a hospital corridor in Ansan. 2 men had stopped him outside his dormitory, said a name she did not recognize, and left him with a broken wrist and a message: "Tell your brother's employer that Do-hyun sends his regards." Funmi got to the hospital at 10 in the night with rain in her shoes and found Min-ho already there, standing outside the ward, having arrived.
For an hour, he did not speak. He paid the bill. He arranged a private room and a transfer. He stood with his hands at his sides, while Tunde, who was 22 and had never been afraid of anything until this year, told him exactly what he thought of men like him. Min-ho took every word without a flinch. Then he told Tunde that he was right and that it would never happen again, and Funmi watched the most feared man in the country bow to her little brother. Later that night, in the car outside her building, with the rain coming down in sheets, Funmi finally broke. She had held everything for 8 months: the visa, the debt, the fear, the studying, the pretending. It came out of her all at once, ugly and shaking, and Min-ho did the only thing he had never learned how to do. He reached across and pulled her into him and held on, one hand at the back of her hair, saying her name into her hair like it was the only word he had left. She did not go up to her flat that night. They drove back through the storm to Songbuk-dong without speaking, and in the doorway of a house she had twice broken into, she was the one who reached for him. He asked her very seriously if she was certain. She said his name once. That was the whole answer. The lamp in the hall went out behind them. The rain kept coming, and everything that had been building for 11 weeks finally, quietly, gave way. The following morning, Funmi woke in grey light with his arm across her and her heart going far too fast, not from happiness, from arithmetic. She was a scholarship student from Lagos in a house with 16 rooms, and the men who married girls like her were not the men who ran countries from studies at 3 in the morning. She lay there listening to him breathe and did what frightened people do. She began, very carefully, to leave. An hour later, Min-ho woke to an empty bed and a note that said she had an early tutorial. He found her at the university at noon, standing outside the studio, and asked what he had done. She said nothing.
He said that was not an answer. She told him that she had watched her father wait 15 years for a woman who never came back, and that she would rather leave first than be left. He said quietly that he had never kept a single thing in his life, and that she was the first thing he intended to keep. That afternoon, they were fine again, or close enough to fine, which is how these things go. But something had opened under the floor, and both of them could feel it. She was afraid he would leave. He was afraid the world would take her. Neither of them knew that the truth already sitting in his desk drawer was going to do more damage than either fear. A few days later, it detonated. Funmi was in the study looking for the original site drawings when the second drawer stuck, and she pulled harder, and it came open on a black ledger and a brown envelope and her mother's coral bead necklace, which she had believed lost since the first night. She stood there holding the necklace. Then she opened the envelope and saw her brother's contract, and saw on the guarantor line, in a hand she now knew as well as her own, the name Kang Min-ho. For a long moment, she could not make her lungs work. She read it 3 times. The lending house had not merely been an asset he inherited. He had signed for its expansion the year Tunde came to Korea. The chain that had swallowed her brother had come off a spool with his name on it, and he had known that from the day he read her file, and he had bought her a coat instead of telling her. When he came home that evening, she was waiting in the hall with the envelope in one hand and the necklace in the other. She asked him one question, whether he had known before or after he offered her the job. He said before. She asked why he had kept her necklace in the same drawer as the contract that ruined her family. He said because they were the only 2 things in the house he could not throw away. She told him that was not an apology. He said it was not meant to be one, that an apology would be an insult, and that he had done it because from the first night he had been terrified that if she knew, she would look at him the way she was looking at him now. Funmi said that he had let her fall in love with a version of him that he had edited. Then she put the necklace on the hall table, which hurt him more than anything she said, and walked out into the cold. That night, she moved into her flatmate's cousin's place in Guro and did not answer her phone. Min-ho did not send men. He did not track her card. He sat in the dark study with the necklace in his fist until 4 in the morning, and then he did the only thing he knew how to do properly. He began, quietly, to dismantle the thing that had cost her.
Over the next 4 days, the lending house Yenwa stopped existing. Every schedule was voided. Every held passport was couriered back to its owner. 1,700 files closed in 96 hours, and 11 billion won in book value went up like paper. Sung-min told him the council would never forgive it. Min-ho said he had not asked them to. He wrote her one message and sent it once. It said only that he had burnt it, all of it, and that she owed him nothing, including forgiveness. On the 5th day, Funmi read that message on a bus in Guro and cried so hard the woman beside her offered a tissue. She did not reply. She was not ready. But that evening, she took her mother's necklace out of her bag, where she had put it back 3 hours after she had left it on his table, and fastened it round her neck. Second question for you, besties. He hid something enormous, then destroyed his own empire to undo it. Is that love or is that guilt? Drop your verdict in the comments, because the next part is where it stops being a choice for either of them. 2 days later, Baek Do-hyun made his move. With Yenwa dead and the council furious, he had everything he needed to take the organization. He had one more thing too. A frightened junior partner called Nam Jae-won, who had been bribed in a car park 6 weeks earlier and who had handed over a site file with a foreign student home address written in the corner. On the Thursday evening,
Funmi finished her bakery shift, stepped out into an alley in Haewa, and did not come home. An hour later, Sung-min brought Min-ho a phone with a single photograph on it. Min-ho looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he set the phone down very gently, and everyone in the room understood that they were watching a man decide to end things. He said one sentence: "Find her by morning, or I will take this city apart street by street until she falls out of it." For the next 6 hours, nobody in that house sat down. Hajin made coffee that nobody drank. Tunde arrived at midnight with his wrist still in a cast and refused to leave. And Min-ho, who had never let a civilian into an operation in his life, gave him a chair and a phone and a job. Sung-min traced the site file to the certification firm and the certification firm to a junior partner, and by 2 in the morning, Nam Jae-won was sitting in a car park with his hands over his face, telling them everything. At 3 in the morning, Jae-won gave them the district, not the address, a container yard somewhere in the Incheon waterfront in one of 11 leaseholds that Do-hyun had bought through names that did not exist. 11 yards, 400 containers, and a man who would move her the moment he heard footsteps. Min-ho stood in front of a map of the coast and understood that he could not do this with muscle. He needed the state. At 4 in the morning, he made a telephone call to a prosecutor named Choi Tae-yoon, who had been trying to build a case against him for 6 years and had never gotten closer than a photograph. Min-ho said he had something to trade. Tae-yoon, half asleep, asked what a man like him could possibly have that was worth waking up for. Min-ho told him 9 years of ledgers, shipping manifests, names, transfers, and every leasehold Do-hyun had ever bought. They met at 5:30 in an empty office in Seoul with the strip lights buzzing. Min-ho put the black ledger on the table and did not sit down. Tae-yoon opened it, read 1 page and went pale. He said that the book would end 30 careers and 5 organizations. He said that it would also end Min-ho, that his own name was on 9 of those pages, and that no lawyer alive could keep him out of a courtroom afterwards. Min-ho said he knew. Tae-yoon, who had wanted this man for 6 years, found himself asking why. Min-ho said that they had taken a woman named Funmi Adeyemi off a street in Haewa at 9:10 last night, and that everything in that book was worth less to him than the 11 minutes it would take to find her. Then he said the thing that Tae-yoon, years later, would repeat at a dinner where he had drank too much, that in 34 years, she was the only thing he had ever wanted to keep. By 7 in the morning, the leasehold list had narrowed to 2. By 7:30, a customs officer confirmed that a generator had been running all night at a yard with no scheduled cargo. Min-ho gave the position to Tae-yoon, and then he went there anyway because he had promised himself that whatever else happened, he would not be somewhere else when that door opened. Meanwhile, in a cold site office at the back of that yard, Funmi had spent 11 hours refusing to be a hostage. She had talked constantly because talking made them nervous. She had memorized 3 voices, and with her hand tied behind a chair, she had spent 4 of those hours walking a loose screw out of the seat frame with her thumbnail. Because a woman who could read a 1974 building plan would certainly read a badly assembled chair. At 8 o'clock, she heard the first car, then the second and the third, and then a great deal of shouting that was not in the tone her guards had been using. Do-hyun came into the office fast, and for the first time she saw fear on him, which told her everything she needed to know about who was outside. She stood up out of a chair she had already half dismantled and told him that he had picked the wrong student.
90 seconds later, the door came off its hinges. Seon-min took a bad hit to the shoulder, getting through it first, and stayed on his feet out of sheer stubbornness. Do-yeon ran 19 meters and met a line of officers coming the other way, and the northern districts changed hands forever in the time it takes to boil a kettle. Min-ho came through that doorway last because Seon-min had physically held him back, and he stopped dead when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Funmi crossed the room with her wrists still red from the rope and put both hands on his face, and Min-ho, who had not knelt to any man alive, went down onto his knees in a filthy container yard and pressed his forehead to her waist and shook. She held his head there and told him she was fine, over and over, while the sun came up over Incheon and the cameras arrived at the gate. Later that morning, in the back of an ambulance with a blanket around her, she asked what it had cost. He told her. All of it. The ledger, the names, his own name, everything, handed to a prosecutor at 5:30 that morning. She stared at him. He said that he had spent 9 years keeping an empire that had never once made him happy, and 11 hours understanding that he would trade it for a single conversation with her. That afternoon, he apologized for something else which she had not expected. He said that his behavior with Jawon at the site was ugly, that being right about the man did not make him right about the jealousy, and that she had been correct in the glass house. Funmi told him that she had never wanted him tame. She wanted him honest. He said that he was working on it and that it was the hardest thing he had ever attempted. 2 days later, the reckoning came from his own side. What remained of the council summoned him to the estate to answer for the ledger. They took his phone at the door, they put men on the gate, and they told him he would not leave until he had signed everything over and taken the blame for everything else. Min-ho, who no longer had anything left to lose and knew a warrant was coming for him regardless, let them, because it was the fastest way to end it. That evening, Hajin got a message out to Funmi from the kitchen door. 6 words. They will not let him leave. Funmi read it standing in the doorway of a bakery in Heiwa with flour on her hands and understood with total clarity that he intended to sit in that house and let the world close over him because he thought that was what he owed her. She did not call the police because he had already given them everything and it was not fast enough. She did not call Seon-min, who had a shoulder full of stitches and 11 men watching him. Instead, she went home, took a photocopy of a 1974 building plan out of a drawer where it had lived for 4 months and looked at a pencil line on the north wall for a long time. At 3 o'clock the next morning, for the 3rd time in her life, Funmi Adeyemi went into that house through the old coal chute. The first time, she had come to steal from him. The second time, she had come to confront him. The 3rd time, she came through the cold and the dark with a torch in her teeth, because a man who had given away an entire empire for her had decided that he was not worth rescuing, and she disagreed. 4 minutes later, she came out of the service corridor into the sealed east wing, went along the passage that only she and a dead architect knew existed, and opened the study door from the side that nobody watched. Min-ho was sitting in the dark exactly where he had been the first night. He looked up. He said her name like a man who had stopped believing in weather, and she told him to get up, because she had not spent 11 days memorizing his grandfather's floor plan to be sentimental about it. They went out the way she had come in, through the coal chute, into the frost, and were 3 streets away before anybody at the gate noticed the study was empty. At 3 o'clock that morning, he walked into Choi Tae-yoon's office of his own accord, in a coat that did not fit him, with a woman holding his hand, and surrendered. By the end of that week, the estate in Seonbuk-dong was seized, along with the cars, the accounts, the shipping company, and the 11 leaseholds that were never his. The council fell apart in 9 days. Nam Jae-won was charged. Bak Do-yeon was charged with 31 offenses and would not see daylight for a long time. And Kang Min-ho, who once ran the largest private organization in the country, owned exactly 1 coat, 1 watch he had already sold, and nothing else.
The cooperation agreement took 11 months.
He served every day of it, and she came every single week without missing one, on the Sunday bus, with a book and a bag of the bread from the Hewa bakery. Somewhere in the 4th month, she stopped being afraid that he would leave her, because it is difficult to fear abandonment from a man who gave away a kingdom and then wrote to her every night about the weather. Meanwhile, Funmi finished her master's with the highest mark in her cohort and did something with the fee he had paid her for a restoration that never happened. When the estate was broken up and auctioned in lots, she bid on the smallest and ugliest lot on the list, a strip of frozen ground at the back and one derelict glass house with green panes and a brass plate at the base of the central bed. The following spring, on the day he came out, there was nobody at the gate but her, in a dark green coat he recognized, standing beside a taxi she had paid for. He had no money, no name, no house, and no idea what a man like him was supposed to do on a Tuesday. She told him he was going to help her carry compost because the camellias were not going to plant themselves. An hour later, she brought him to the glass house. He stood in the doorway of a room he had not entered since he was 9 years old, in front of 100 cracked pots and his mother's brass plate, polished. Funmi told him the deeds were in her name and always would be, and that he was welcome there for as long as he wanted to be, which she suspected was going to be quite a long time. Min-ho did not manage to say anything at all for a while. Over the next few months, they built a life so small it would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had feared him. A flat above the bakery in Hewa, his hands, which had signed orders that moved pots, learning to repair glazing bars. Tunde working legally, visiting on Sundays, and still calling him Hyung with a certain amount of sarcasm. Hajin coming every Thursday, ostensibly to check on the plants. Seungmin, who could no longer lift his left arm properly, running a small legitimate haulage firm with 2 lorries and enormous pride. That autumn, on the first evening the camellias flowered, he asked her. There was no restaurant and no helicopter and no ring from a house in Cheongdam because he had nothing, and both of them knew that was exactly the point. He took her mother's coral bead necklace out of his pocket, which he had carried since the night she left it on the hall table, and he fastened it round her neck and said the only line he had ever rehearsed in his life, that everything he had ever owned was gone, and she was all he had kept. Funmi, who had once broken into his house to steal a brown envelope, cried in a greenhouse and said yes. They married that winter in the glass house with 40 guests, a borrowed suit, and heaters running off a generator that Seungmin swore was legal. Tunde walked her in. Hajin cried from the first minute to the last. Choi Tae-yoon came, sat at the back, and told the man beside him that he had put half the country away, and this was the only case that had ever kept him awake. When Min-ho was asked whether he took her, he answered before the sentence had finished. A year and a half later, on an ordinary Sunday morning in a small flat above a bakery, Funmi came out to the kitchen where her husband was burning toast and badly, and took his hand and put it flat on her stomach. Min-ho went completely still, the way he had gone still in a doorway on the night she first fell out of his ceiling. She watched his face and saw a man who once was the most feared name in Seoul, discover that he had absolutely no idea what to do with his own hands. He knelt down in the middle of the kitchen, pressed his forehead to her, and said her name once, the way he always had, like the only word he had left. Outside, in a glass house that his mother had planted and his wife had bought back, 100 white camellias were coming into bloom, and nothing in that house was locked at all.